This programme was produced at and first aired on MPR, Manawatu People's Radio, with support from New Zealand On Air. Ka pai Irarangi Te Motu, MPR.
Kia ora and welcome to Reserved Recommendations. This is a show about great trash, difficult art, and our complicated relationships with art and culture. My name's Hugh, I'm the host of the show, and I'd like to take this opportunity to put in a very mild content warning for the show as a whole. Sometimes our recommendations on this show are reserved just because the thing that we're discussing is in some way not good, but sometimes there are aspects of the art or artist that may be confronting for some people. Check the episode descriptions for more information, and do be aware of your listening environment. Kia ora, you're listening to Reserved Recommendations. This is a radio show and podcast on Manawatu People's Radio, Te Reo Irirangi o ngā Tangata o Manawatu. It's about great trash and complicated relationships with art and culture, and this evening I am joined by Matthew Jenkin, who I've not talked to in like verbal sound type ways in a very long time. How's it going, Matthew?
Pretty good.
Excellent.
Down in the south, so not suffering from the lockdown and additional worries going on in Auckland. And
yeah, Manawatu manages to be reasonably untouched by a lot of that stuff, but we have been in the lockdown as well. So just riding it out. Unlike the last one of these that I recorded, I'm not recording it in the middle of the afternoon, so there's not children having like difficulties with tablets down the other end of the dining table while I'm trying to record this. So that's small mercies. Now,
just background noise.
The thing that you were keen to talk about, and this is something that I kind of don't know much about, so this is one of the ones where you kind of have to explain something to me like I'm an idiot at least some of the time. And hopefully that's entertaining, is you wanted to talk a bit about escape rooms and the related family of puzzles. And the only experience I have with anything that approaches that is I got given for a Christmas or a birthday or something, one of those like escape room at home type kits. So it's not like a room full of puzzles, but you get like a little board game box with like a journal that you have to decipher, and it's the same sort of process of, I guess, of going through puzzles within a time limit to try and get to an end goal. But aside from that, I don't know much about them. There are a couple in Palmy, but I've never been to any of them.
Interesting. No, I haven't experienced the at-home version myself. I've done a few here in Dunedin. So the basic idea that should be fairly obvious is you and a group of people get put into a room and you're told your objective is to get out this door. To do that, you search around in the room to find puzzles, solve puzzles. Those puzzles will help you to get to other puzzles, which eventually will lead you to finding often a key or a code for a lock for the door to get out. They often get used or promoted as good team building exercises, as such things often do, which is kind of where some of my reservations about recommending them come in, because from my own experience with group work, and I'm sure you all have remember this from studying especially, like whenever you're studying and you're assigned to a group and you have to complete an assignment as a group, we'll know that you'll have the person who wants to get an A, the person who just wants to pass, the person who doesn't really want to be there, and the person who would be quite happy to sort of get whatever they get, but is distracted by 16 other things and so forth. So it's another of those sort of experiences that, depending on who you've got around you, could be fantastic or it could be horrible.
Yeah, I mean, it reminds me of a couple of things. One of them I will ask you about in a second, because it's perhaps a way of talking about puzzles in general and the way that people deal with them. But it reminds me a bit of when I was first getting into tabletop role-playing games, I had a couple of very formative experiences, and that sent me kind of investing in particular role-playing systems and particular like online communities that talked about and thought about things in a particular way. And after doing that for a few years, I realized that actually there was a very specific group of people that I'd had the first couple of games with, and that had primed me to expect a particular approach, and that wasn't what I would get with other people, kind of regardless of what I was playing. And I wonder if that's like
very much so.
If that's a comparable thing. The other thought I had was it, in the sense of like a puzzle that leads you to another puzzle that leads you to another puzzle that leads you to another puzzle. I was reminded of like the golden age of adventure games for particularly desktop computers. And the way in which your enjoyment of those is often related to the way in which you engage with the intended solution. Like there were particular areas of those games that were notorious for kind of leaps of moon logic. And I wonder if there's a certain, again, I haven't done any of these games, but if there's a certain similar thing about trying to guess what it is that you think that the puzzle designer expected you to want to do.
Yeah. Well, I mean, this is getting into sort of stuff related to the history of where escape rooms came from, and as you say, talking about puzzles in general. So, yes, computer adventure games were a very strong influence on them. A lot of people have cited Myst being an adventure game from 93, I think it was, which was one of the first adventure games that was more from a first-person perspective. So you were looking at a space as though you were standing there looking at it, and you were clicking around it with the mouse for what are things here? Is there something hidden behind this? Can I find items which I can then use elsewhere to achieve goals? And as you say, a lot of the puzzles were huge leaps of strange moon logic.
It was also... this might be more true of Riven, because I don't think I played Myst, but I did play Riven. And the thing with Riven in particular was that there wasn't the kind of narrative frame that you got with like your classic Sierra or what was the other company that made a lot of them? Anyway,
LucasArts.
Yeah, LucasArts and Sierra adventure games, there was often kind of a narrative frame. You are this person trying to achieve this thing. And in Riven, you're just kind of dropped into this, for the 90s, utterly gorgeous 3D rendered world. And then you just kind of walk around and do some stuff. And it's very hard to work out like what it is you're even necessarily trying to achieve, aside from maybe getting to another place.
Yeah, no, there were a lot more in that. Not really sort of strong narrative behind it. So that had a lot of influence on people in the early days of the web, because with back sort of around early 2000s was the sort of golden age of Flash games, which of course Flash Player being obsolete now. But so this style of game was an easy one to implement for a sort of one or two people in a Flash game context. But so because it was a simple thing of, right, I can have this scene that I'm showing and people can click around in the scene and do things. So the same reason that you saw a lot of hidden object games and such things like that. But the challenge was that in order to not have to create huge numbers of these elaborate backdrops to look at, it was a convenient excuse to say, well, okay, what if we're just in one single location? And that immediately leads to an obvious narrative hook of you are trapped in this one single location and your objective is to try and get out of it. And these style of games were very popular. But again, little narrative. It is just, here you are, you're in a room, get out. They might have more strong themes to them. So some were very sort of horror themed. You must get out before the ghosts come out and get you, or whatever nasty creatures are lurking in the shadows. And some are just, you're in a room, good luck. And so you can't easily point to a sort of first commercial escape room sort of in person so much, because it was a fairly obvious confluence of those ideas of computer adventure games and live action role playing, as you mentioned earlier, coming together, and people thinking, hey, we can put people in a physical room doing this. It doesn't need to be a huge space. We can get several people in and they'll do it and have fun. But so again, the constraints applied create an interesting sort of variation on the game, because unlike a computer game or a LARP where you're probably having multiple sessions over sort of a weekly session for however long you're meeting, or a computer game where you can save and come back later, here you've got a definite, right, you've got about an hour. It's probably not wise to go over that, because a lot of things have found that people aren't good at concentrating for longer than about an hour at a time. Hence why it tends to be a standard length of lectures or meetings or
podcast episodes.
Your podcasts, yes, just to name a few. So Moon Logic is going to be right out, because it's got to be things that a reasonable person can expect to be able to figure out within an hour. And also, you don't get some of these, like a lot of computer adventure games, again, because of the broader scope, you'd have umpteen different puzzles that you're solving all at once, and an item from one could help you with another, but you don't figure that out until later, and you don't know specifically sort of where you're supposed to be working. But again, this is constrained, so you've probably got it can still be quite complicated in terms of how the different puzzles relate together and eventually come together to give you your final thing. Or it may be very linear, that you have to solve this one and that will give you the necessary thing to solve the next one. But either way, it's going to be more restricted.
I mean, also, they won't pull dirty tricks on you, at least in theory. I remember getting into the habit from computer adventure games of just picking up everything that you can interact with, and then one of the Space Quest games specifically setting you up with an object where if you pick it up and then move to the next screen, you'll immediately die.
Oh,
just so that they can prime you with that particular impulse and then punish you for it.
Yes.
Yeah. So the thing that I really noticed with the kind of sit around the table and solve it out of a book game that I worked on, I think it was actually while we were stuck in the last lockdown, actually, but was that there was definitely an underlying logic to the entire book that informed all of the puzzles, and there was a big period where we were all sitting around the table completely stumped, and then one of us worked out, I think, how you were supposed to, it was something physical you were supposed to do with the book to solve the first puzzle, and that kind of informed how all of the rest of them were supposed to go, and then there was a sort of cascade. And I wondered if that was a thing that you experience in those kind of situations as well.
You probably could. The other thing about it is, because they are multiple people coming up with these ideas and all over the world, there's a huge variety of different styles of things. So, I mean, I got the idea to have this conversation with you from listening to one of your previous episodes talking about immersive theatre. And in that, described escape rooms as being a type of immersive theatre, which was one of those sort of interesting light bulb moments to me, of sort of, I never considered it in that perspective before, because for the most part, the things I'd experienced and was aware of was entirely your group working through something, but you could have it, and some places do, with other NPCs, in a sense, non-player characters, for those not down with the lingo, basically actors in there interacting and doing other things in the case, which would also add to the scope for different sorts of puzzles. You could have interrogations or translations or other things going on.
Yeah, there's you can actually find it all on YouTube, I believe, but there was a British game show in the early 90s called Nightmare, which was about putting children into primitive green screen mazes and making them interact mostly with actors who were kind of half improvising with them. And there were a lot of like, pick an object and give it to a character as a present and they'll help you, or this person is going to ask you a series of riddles or general knowledge questions, usually about, like, because it was a medieval themed thing, in this case, usually like Arthurian myth and legend in particular. But lots of that kind of stuff would open up if you start using actors. Yes,
there's been other game shows in there, like the Crystal Maze is often, which I believe has a modern version now.
Oh, I wasn't aware of that.
It's got the guy from the crowd. I don't know how to pronounce his name.
Is it Richard Iowade?
That's the one, yeah. I believe he's the host of it. But yeah, the original version was back in the 80s or 90s somewhere. And again, that same sort of style of moving through a space, having to solve puzzles and interact with potentially people in the space. So the scope is huge for all sorts of things you can do with it. But yeah, there's surprising challenges of trying to come up with the right sort of challenges that are going to stump people a bit, but not too much.
And I mean, you've done a few of these things. How have you found that people do it at gauging that? Have you found that the ones in Dunedin at least are reasonably well balanced, or have you found that, you know, with the wrong group of people you can just kind of get stuck?
Well, all the ones I've done have been with my immediate family, so which in some ways made things a lot easier, because it's a case of, right, these are people I'm very familiar with, have a pretty good idea of how they tick already, so there's not going to be any sudden surprises of this person is going to try and take over, or this person is going to... Sorry?
And I was going to say, and if I may be permitted to speculate a little, you're all reasonably intellectually inclined, possibly to the point of a bit nerdy, which, I mean...
Only a bit.
That makes a collection of puzzles an easier thing to approach than maybe a random group of work colleagues might.
Well, in the interests of full disclosure, one of the main parts of my job for about 10 years was teaching problem solving to third-year computer scientists through the medium of puzzles. So yeah, I'm kind of sort of inclined that way into the start. So,
well,
yes.
and so, well, to then continue with that question, you know, as someone who's done a lot of that, do you have thoughts about puzzle design and how you best do that in that particular kind of situation? Because obviously, as you say, there are constraints when you're working in a limited space and with real physical things. So you can't do make a cat walk into some sellotape so that you can make a fake moustache from cat hair type puzzle.
You're familiar with that one. Yes.
It's
a notorious puzzle.
Yes. But it's as
for
well
a fake
as
moustache for a fake ID for a person that didn't have a moustache in the first place.
As well as being very silly, it's also an example of the sort of thing that you could only do in a kind of imaginary space.
Yes, very much. So there's some interesting. So from a couple of techniques that I noted from ones I've done that I thought were very helpful for that. I mean, in part, having a very linear approach does help with that because you have a clearer sense of this is what I'm trying to solve at the moment, and there's no point worrying about this other thing because I don't have anything for that, and we'll find out the clues for that later. So that helps focus you. But there's a lot of subtle things you can do to actually connect things together, like including similar colors and patterns on things. So like if the clue is on a blue piece of paper and there's a big blue padlock on the cupboard next to you, that's a hint that this clue is for finding the code for that padlock. So things like that can be used to help direct you as to where this thing is supposed to go, which is kind of even more important if you're in a more branching out sort of set of puzzles where it's not a strict solve them in this order. It is, here is a bunch of puzzles. Each of them will help you sort of progress, but there's no particular order that you need to do. You just have to solve them all to get to combine to get the final thing. So yeah, having connections between what the clue is and what the thing you're trying to do with that clue is going to be helpful. And there's a saying that you never understand the solution until you understand the problem. And so it's usually a good idea to try and set things up so that people will discover something that they are trying to get at, whether that's a locked cupboard or a briefcase or a coded message that they're trying to find a way to decode before they come across the clue that will enable them to solve that, because it means that they're primed for thinking, okay, I'm looking for something that will help me do this. So when they see a thing that relates to that, they think, that's where it relates to.
That's interesting because I mean that's got lots of analogs in terms of lots of creative projects as well. You know, that's the difference between a twist in a movie that feels earned and one that doesn't. For example, is are you just saying something and then claiming that it makes everything in the movie make sense, or did you actually do some planting so that there is some coherent payoff? Similarly in music, are you just doing a thing, or have you kind of suggested it a little bit a couple of times so that people can go, oh yeah, that's an idea, and then you can expand on it? I'm not quite sure where I was going with that. It just struck me as an interesting bit of the way
that's an important point, because I decided a while ago with this is getting a bit off topic, but in terms of things like a twist in a movie, what you don't want is for that to invalidate the initial question that the movie is about. So most movies have a central sort of question that is going to be answered by the end of the movie. It's like, will Indiana Jones stop the Nazis from getting this artifact? Or will attractive male and attractive female manage to get together? Whatever the thing is. And if the twist turns out to render that initial question invalid, then I think it's a bad twist. Versus if it adds nuance and reflects ideas that related to that, it works as a twist. So, spoilers for a couple of movies. The Sixth Sense is the one everyone loves because that didn't invalidate the question. Is this guy going to manage to sort of get his life together? And the answer is, well, no, because he can't. He's really trying to get his afterlife together. So it adds a sort of thing, but it's not changing the thing. Whereas there was a film called The Tourist, which was, I rag on a bit is Johnny Depp and Angelina Jolie
I've
swanning around fancy places in Europe. And a lot of the thing was about presenting Johnny Depp as being this sort of everyman. I think he was supposed to be a high school teacher or something who had finally saved up and was going on a big holiday, and he gets caught up in this sort of intrigue because the femme fatale comes and acts like he's actually this bad guy who's gotten plastic surgery. And the whole way through, you're thinking, right, here is this poor schmuck trying to sort of get himself out of this situation, not of his own making. And then the big twist at the end is that he is actually this thing. And it was all a sort of cunning plan on his part to reintroduce himself to the situation, but cast doubt on him being exactly what is. So it's a double bluff type of thing. But because of that, that invalidates the original question of, is this everyman going to get out of this messy situation, not of his own making? So
no, I'm sure there are other examples I can think of, but they have gone out of my head at the very moment. Well, look, this is a very interesting conversation. We are around about at half time, so it's probably about time that we take a break, and we will be back right after this.
Support this show and others like it by giving a donation. For more information, go to www.mpr.nz/donate.
And you're back. We are on Reserved Recommendations. This is a radio show and podcast about difficult art, great trash, and complicated relationships with art and culture. I'm talking to Matthew Jenkin, sort of tangentially about escape rooms, but also about puzzles and puzzle design and planting and payoff recently. So
it's got a little off topic.
Well, getting into the weeds is kind of part of the brand, I think. To return to a previous question, how have you found the escape rooms that you've been to in Dunedin, and how do you feel like they have? I mean, without naming and shaming people necessarily, but how do you feel like they've done in terms of that
there? So it's kind of difficult to.
Puzzle design stuff.
I think they've generally done a pretty good job of it. I think there's usually been reasonably clear what goes with what, as I was saying earlier about having things that tie the clues to the solutions together. So this is one of the ways in which, unlike, as you were saying earlier, a computer puzzle game adventure where all sorts of weird and strange things can happen, you don't have that option, but you do have scope for a lot of different types of puzzles. So you can introduce things involving a lot more stuff related to sound, which is especially the early things like Mist and Riven would have been not especially great, depending on, because back in those days it was, do you have a sound card? No, then you're stuck with sort of beeps. So there were things like, it's difficult to talk about some of these without giving away particular puzzle solutions for them. But yeah, I
was going to say,
at the risk of slight spoilers, one where we found opening one suitcase, we found a little tape recorder thing, and that played a short piece of music. Just, sort of a 5 seconds, the start of a Beethoven or something. I can't remember what it was. And while I think this was with my mother and my brother at the time in that room, and while me and my mother was sort of sitting there thinking, what on earth is that related to? My brother, who funnily enough is the one of us who's done the most music related stuff, went, and wandered over to another locked cupboard and knocked on the door in the same tune, and the door opened. So he immediately saw the connection, and the cupboard had a musical imagery on it, so there was that connection as well. But so that was a really interesting little puzzle that I don't think you could do in any other medium other than physically being in a space and being able to interact with objects. Another one that didn't work out quite so well, that in a thing we found a series of little glass jars that were numbered, and you had to figure out, based on another clue, when you opened the glass jars, you discovered each of them had a scent. And then you had to use those scents to figure out what each was, and that gave you an order of things, which gives information for something else. But the reason that was tricky was that it was a great idea, but I think a couple of the scents weren't distinct enough. So it's like, okay, this one is obviously this, but that one could be that or this, and it's not really clear. So I think we got to a situation where we're down to the last two, and we just didn't know which way we had to go.
Yeah, I mean that's very interesting, because it reminds me in some ways of thinking about like encounter design in a tabletop role playing game, where you're like, okay, well, I'm going to set this up so that I've got these 3 players who've got these different things that they've set their characters up with. I'm going to make it so that this one can do this thing, and this one can do this thing, and this one can do this thing. And similarly, it sounds like one of the things that worked quite well with the music puzzle was that they'd kind of gone, all right, well, we're likely to get, we're inherently going to be dealing with groups of people, and their skills are going to spread. So we'll try and spread what things you need to be good at in order to solve these puzzles. And perhaps a contrast with that is I have or we have as a family in our collection of board games. Have you heard of 221B Baker Street, the board game?
Is that the one with about 15 or 20 different locations, and you all go around and get a clue at each location?
Yeah, that's exactly it. Yeah. You go around.
Some of our family has that too. Yes.
You go around a board which is supposed to represent London, and you're supposed to be Sherlock Holmes trying to solve a crime by collecting clues. But the thing about 221B Baker Street is that the clues are often you have to have a kind of general knowledge, and then you grab a word from an acronym, and then that word will give you the first initial that you're trying to use to fill out, letter by letter, fill out a clue or something like that.
Yes, it was an odd mixture of, there is no clue for this location, the murderer was X, or a cryptic crossword.
Well, that's it. And the thing is, because 221B Baker Street was made whenever it was made, and they haven't done what something like Trivial Pursuit does and updated it, you're expected to know things like what the PLO is as an organization. I don't know if the PLO is even still extant. I remember that's the Palestinian Liberation Organization. I remember them being in the news.
There was something about that, yeah.
At some point, probably when I was a teenager in the 90s is when I remember that from. But you never hear about them now. So if you were not paying attention to the news, possibly specifically in the right country at the right time, then you're going to be completely stumped by that clue without any chance of grasping it. And that seems to me like very, very poor puzzle design in a lot of ways.
Yes, you don't want to get too specific with knowing this particular detail, unless you've either you know something about the people that are going in. So if you know that all of your participants are going to be, I don't know, art history students, then maybe you could have a clue that requires knowing something about Monet, for example. But yeah, for the general public, you wouldn't necessarily assume that every group's going to have someone that would know that. So yeah, if you have a geography puzzle, there should be a world map somewhere in the room, or that kind of thing.
Yeah. I mean, it's a similar challenge to, I suppose, like composing something like a pub quiz. You know, you want to be difficult, but you also want to be broad enough that a team of average people should be able to, in theory, cover it with their own individual areas of interest without needing any particularly weird people on the team.
Yes, although pub quizzes do tend to seem to go well when you've got one or two weird people on the team.
Oh yeah, I mean, it's useful to have them up your sleeve.
Yes, but it shouldn't be necessary. Yeah. Well, and that ties in with kind of an interesting side note, is that as well as the design and planning of the level of the encounter design, as you put it. So having a thought of, right, what are the collective skills going to be coming in? How do we make sure that all of them feel useful? Is that as well, if you've got a time limit of an hour to say that, you know, you have to escape the room in the hour, there should be a possibility of not getting out, but at the same time, you want most people to get out, and you want them to get out probably at around an hour. So, I mean, whether that's sort of 5 minutes early, 5 minutes late, like often there's enough time sort of allocated to you book for a longer unit of time than just the hour, because obviously there's got to be set up and clean up things before and after, and briefings and debriefings. But it also means that if you're beavering away and time is about to run out, but you're working on the last puzzle, the game master or staff member who's sometimes outside, sometimes inside the room, depends on the way that particular thing does it, but is in some form of communication with you, like to offer hints sometimes, will be able to sort of use their discretion to say, right, they're almost there, just give them a couple of minutes, they'll get out, they'll be happy, it's great, so forth, versus when they're obviously nowhere near it.
And I mean, it's about keeping people engaged for the duration as well. Even if you don't get out, if you have spent the whole time exploring and having fun, then you're still going to feel like, you know, this is time well spent and we enjoyed it, even though we didn't get anywhere near it. Yeah.
Again,
I mean,
like a pub quiz.
To shift it into a different game design paradigm, you could contrast it with a game like Monopoly, where it's possible to lose reasonably early in the game and then be stuck orbiting the board, gaining and losing trivial amounts of money until eventually you land on something big enough to kill you, but not really have any scope of being able to improve your situation in any way.
Indeed.
That strikes me as a thing that you want to avoid, if at all possible.
There is another concept from game design that I think applies kind of well. So it talks about, like, if you're creating a game where you're, say, a computer game where the protagonist is the character is an adventurer doing things like an Indiana Jones or a Lara Croft or a whatever, you want to have moments like the ducking under a stone door at the last minute, or just managing to swing over a spiked pit. And so whenever there is a time limit imposed in a game, you want to be careful that people are able to actually complete it in that time, but you don't want them to. Well, you want it to be challenging enough that the vast majority of people are going to get there in the last 10% of the time. So they get that feeling of squeaking through at the last minute, because if you solve it like that and pop through and you've still got sort of most of your time, it's like, oh, well, that wasn't actually very dense or exciting. And obviously it's a bummer to lose. So you want to make sure that only the very last sort of bit lose, and you have the sense of, oh, I was almost there. Let me try again. I'll get it this time. And I think you want a similar thing with escape rooms, that you want people to be close to the time.
Yeah, no, again, I'm just going to keep relating things to different forms of games, but I've been playing my way steadily through the Dark Souls series of games, and they're notoriously hard action games. But the thing about Dark Souls is that they're not hard in that they want you to do something very difficult. They're hard in that if you stuff up the thing that they're trying to teach you to do, then you'll fail very quickly and have to go back and do it again. So the trick is about learning the language that the game has to tell you that something is about to happen, and then responding appropriately, which is a similar sort of thing about, take the hint that this large stone door is coming down, or the ceiling is about to squish you into a pancake, and do the appropriate thing in the appropriate time scale, so that you get the correct outcome.
Yes, there's a lot of good game design in those games. I don't know beyond that much of it is directly applicable to an escape room, given that the not so much about dying multiple times and figuring out the timing of a nasty big monster swinging half a tree at you, but...
Well, no, I mean, it's more that you can apply the logic of an escape room to them than vice versa, I suspect. There's
parallels in all sorts of ways, yes.
I guess the other thing that's probably led to I'm just thinking about it, the thing that's probably led to the proliferation of escape rooms is that they're not too... Like there's intellectual effort that goes into putting one together, but they're not, they don't demand a huge amount of real estate or practical or technical investment. Like you don't have to build something phenomenally expensive in order to make an engaging one. Indeed.
Which is, so going back to the history of them, there's the first sort of thing that's cited as being an escape room that most people agree on was in about 2007 in Japan. So there had been similar things cropping up in various places in the few years before then, but it was really in the early 2010s that it took off. And part of this was some complaint about a prominent article that was written about this thing, which said very much as you said yourself, these things are cheap to set up. Lots of people can come in and enjoy them. You'll be making sort of heaps of money. This is a great investment. And so a lot of people sort of heard about them and got on the bandwagon, but didn't necessarily do as well or as thing. Because this gets into one of the challenges of the running an escape room is that even if you've got a great set of puzzles that tie together well and fit with what a theme of the room, if you're giving it a theme, because you don't have to. Again, sometimes it just be, you're in a room, good luck. Once you've solved the puzzle, you know what the solution is. So even if you come in with a different group of people, it's not going to be as interesting the next time, because you're going to even if everyone else is sort of busy trying to solve things, you'll be thinking, oh yeah, that's the thing that's in that drawer over there, and then we'll be doing that, and yeah, I guess we'll be out.
Although, I mean, if you were clever about it, you could mess with that, because in theory you could make your puzzles kind of modular if you're thinking about small and reasonably portable things. And so you might, recognize a puzzle from the last time, but not get it in the same order or have to do a different thing to get to it.
Yeah, and that is a good strategy for giving them a bit more replay value, is having those. Maybe it's the same sort of puzzle, but there's different clues or different things. But yeah, it's still tricky to make them so that there is a motivation to go back, because most people, even if they're doing that, most people are going to assume, oh, okay, I've been there, done that. And so they tend to try and more put in different themes and create new ones. So, okay, everyone's been through this one, we're going to give up on it and move on to a new one. So it's not the absurdly sort of good investment money spinner that it was purported to be.
Yes, yeah, and I mean that's a thing that people will have to grapple with. Well, look, thank you very much, Matthew. We are getting kind of close to time, but there are two things that I like to do by way of wrapping this up. The first is to ask if people have enjoyed this conversation, they're interested in, puzzles, escape rooms, those sorts of things. Are there particular specific things other than just like check out your local escape room? There's probably one in your town because they're freaking everywhere, that you could recommend to people?
Well, as you say, my main recommendation would just be, if this sounds interesting, have a look at in your local area. I can't vouch for the level of them because they've all got a different approach. They're probably, I mean, most of them aren't franchises or anything like that, so you're not going to see the same room in a different location or anything. So yeah, go in with an open mind, and even if it's not a great escape room, you can probably still have a good time. But yeah, do be careful about who you choose to go with. And yeah, it was kind of one of the things I was thinking we might end up going on about, was thinking about personality types and that kind of stuff. But yeah, maybe a discussion for another day.
Yeah, I mean, we can return to that on a different episode, perhaps. I think Indeed. The thing that I would recommend is probably actually firing up YouTube and checking out Nightmare. Nightmare in the Crystal Maze is really good, and it's got Richard O'Brien in it, who is always a delight. But
see the guy from Rocky Horror.
That's right. He's the guy who created Rocky Horror Picture Show and was Riff Raff in the movie version. He's a very strange, laconic presence as a host, and sort of simultaneously helps people out and taunts them when they get things wrong. And people will be like sweating trying to solve a puzzle, and he'll be leaning up against the wall playing a mouth organ. It's very specific.
I can definitely imagine that from the vibe he gives off.
The reason that I would recommend Nightmare in particular, though, is because it's interesting to watch as a grown-up, because it's pitched at a very specific kind of age group. And so it's kind of like, you know how you would like read a joke book for kids, and it's a really interesting way of working out what the mechanics of a joke is, because the jokes are all really obvious. And so you can really see how the moving parts that fit together. It's kind of like that for those kinds of riddle and give the right thing to the right person puzzles, because it's kind of pitched at 10-year-olds. And it's really interesting to try and kind of watch those, when those bits come together and when they don't. And also the whole thing's on YouTube for free, and it's tremendously campy British TV from the early 90s.
There can be no higher endorsement than that.
Tremendously campy, low-budget British TV is great. Yes. Finally, do you have things that you would like to pitch or plug? Are there things that you're doing or things that people you know and like are doing that you want people to pay attention to?
Nothing specific that I would directly put in this. I mean, as there's probably several people my age, I have a blog that gets updated maybe a couple of times a year. Because everyone's moved on to podcasts and other things. So I don't have a lot of advertising that I would like to present, but feel free to insert your own plugs if you wish.
Go and check out things. They're good.
Yes.
Things in general. We approve of them. Excellent.
Things.
Well, look, thank you once again, Matthew. This has been a fascinating conversation. As I say, we can perhaps come back and discuss, meshing personalities and trying to do group tasks another time, because crikey, have I done some things in that sphere, which, it's one of those kind of eternal human experiences. Yeah.
Indeed. Thank you very much for having me.
You've been listening to Reserved Recommendations, a radio show and podcast from Manawatu People's Radio, Te Reo Irirangi o ngā tangata o Manawatu. The show was produced and presented by me, Hugh Dingwall, and I also composed our theme music. It's called Sack Jazz, and you can find it at wolfboy.bandcamp.com. If you enjoyed this show, why not go ahead and share it with a friend? You can find the last 10 episodes at npr.nz/show/reserved, or wherever else you get your podcasts. If you want an episode older than that, try searching for Reserved Recommendations on YouTube. You can find me on Twitter at Objective Realty, or you can follow the show on Facebook. And finally, Manawatu People's Radio is a non-profit community access station. If you like this or any other piece of their fine audio programming, why not fling them $1 or $2? You can go to npr.nz/donate for more information on how to do that.